It was an accident. It could have happened to anyone, which makes me wonder why it had to happen to me. I've worked construction for years. I've never so much as gotten a deep cut or broke a bone. Bruises sometimes, minor cuts. Nothing that stopped me from coming in the next day, though. It was just a typical day, really. I was performing an inspection, chatting with a buddy on a side job, and listening to the sound of an active construction site as it thrummed around me. Insurance would try to prove that I hadn't been wearing my safety gear, but I had witnesses that could attest that I'd been wearing my goggles, my hard hat, and my OSHA-approved gear when it happened. The drug test they had submitted me to showed I had nothing stronger in my system than the bagel I'd had for breakfast. It wasn't the fault of anyone besides whoever attached the rebar to that girder, I suppose. Even then, it wasn't really the welder's fault. It had simply come loose and stood there, waiting for me to get careless. On that day, I turned suddenly as I was inspecting an area of the basement, when a jutting piece of rebar, which I had made note of 1,000 times, pierced my safety goggles and stabbed right into my left eye. The members of my crew found me on the floor of the basement as I started to scream. The piece of rebar had gone through my goggles due to a slight fracture in the lens. That, plus my forward momentum, had caused the lens to break and my eye to be punctured. The rebar, as it happens, had been covered in dust. The dust caused the cut to become infected with a virulent strain of bacteria and ultimately required the removal of my eye. I tell you all this to explain how I came to be in a hospital bed, minus an eye, and strapped to the bed as soon as I finish writing this, since they fear I might be a danger to myself. But that's getting a little ahead of the story, I guess. It started the first night after I lost my eye. I'd been rushed to the ER right away, and the prognosis had been bad almost at once. There was definitely damage. There was the virulent strain of bacteria in the wound that was reacting badly. It was decided that it would be best if the eye was removed immediately to save the rest of my face. They were keeping me overnight to monitor the wound, make sure they got all the bacteria out, make sure the wound was healing properly as well. I remember laying there before I drifted off, trying to come to terms with my new vision and wondering how different my life would be with only one eye. When I drifted off, I was suddenly greeted by something terrible. I was looking through a single eye, staring up at a red, unbroken sky the color of old flames. Long runners of fire, falling stars they looked like, were cascading down, and I could hear a thundering as my point of view shook with the near constant vibration. I was low, making me think I was less than an inch tall, and though I could look around, I couldn't move. Things were moving around me, though, creatures of perverted geometry. They lumbered about as though every step pained them greatly. As I watched them, something long and spidery, like a needle with wings, descended on me, its long proboscis growing as it landed astride my point of view. As the needle came down towards me, I woke up screaming. The nurses tried to calm me down, telling me I had just had a nightmare, and I tried to drift back off to sleep, visions of that smoldering place still in my head. The next time I closed my eyes, I was staring up at that crimson sky again. The fire was still raining down, but now I was staring at an absolute horror of a creature as it cocked its head in a nearly feline curiosity. It looked almost skeletal, like a Halloween decoration that moved a little too well. As I watched it, it scuttled a little closer, stalking my point of view. Its eye sockets were bare, I thought, but the closer it got, the better I could see a pair of bright yellow pinpricks in the depths of those cavernous sockets. Its ink-black tongue would flick out every now and again, so it could moisten its seemingly bony lips. It was skulking in on 6 strangely jointed legs, and it reminded me of Toothless from the How to Train Your Dragon movies. Well, Toothless's skeleton at least. It cocked its head as it towered over me, but when it opened its mouth, I felt another scream break through my sleeping lips. Its mouth was like a garbage disposal full of teeth, 2 sets spinning in a circular buzzsaw pattern as it hissed and screamed at me. The screams could have broken glass, and my ears actually started bleeding as it screeched over me. The head snapped down, strange teeth covering my point of view, and I woke up to 2 orderlies restraining me. That's when someone stuck a needle in my neck and I was left in a mercifully dreamless sleep. But dreams, it seems, were the least of my worries that night. I was treated to that same sky, that same damn amber sky, until the drugs wore off. In that time, I saw those lumbering giants make their way across the blasted land. I saw human beings, too, as they made their way across the blasted land, some of them trampled by the lumbering behemoths, or hunted and maimed by those skeletal horrors. Little burnt tan creatures, almost like frogs that had learned how to walk, capered about, shoving and kicking at the naked, stumbling humans that walked about confusedly. Their skin was seared, their bodies bleeding, but no matter what happened to them, they just kept screaming and writhing in endless pain. The vision went on and on, an endless hell that I was forced to watch as the world on the other side moved on. I don't know if it was heaven or hell, but the only thing that remained the same was the crimson sky and the burning rain. The rest of that day, I was kept in a medical-induced state, living in that hell and seeing its atrocities. In that time, it felt as though I slept for years. Time had no meaning in that place, and the lumbering beasts became a sort of rude clock for me. They would lumber by periodically, and I would mark that as an hour. Their footsteps would shake the ground, making my peripheral shudder, and my vision felt like ripples on a pond. Of the strange skeletal creatures, there was very little to see after the first one. None of them approached me again. The mosquito creatures kept their distance as well. I suppose they hadn't found me particularly tasty, so they were content to leave me alone. That was until one of the little brown creatures came to investigate. I'd been staring at that amber sky for 2 passes of the lumbering beasts when a face that only a mother could love swam up out of the void. It was so sudden that I yelped internally, not really sure what to do now that something living had come close again. Nothing had come to bother me for so long that I had begun to think my position was going to remain this dull little space until I eventually came out of this state. The ugly, lumpy creature bent down, bringing its face very close to my position, before wrapping a hand around me and bathing me in far too welcoming darkness. Light peeked through the fingers as we ran, but that seemed to be the point where the drugs were beginning to wear off, and I started to come out. I squinted my remaining eye at the heavy rays of the afternoon sun, and felt my stomach rumble at the tray that sat before me. When the nurse came in, smiling, as she watched me eat, I asked her how long I had been out for. I expected it to be a week, maybe a month, but she told me it had been about 12 hours. It felt as though I had spent years in that terrible place, counted out days' worth of hours by the passing of the creatures, and I felt that I never wanted to go back there again. I wasn't sure if it was the act of sleeping or just the act of closing my eyes, but I spent the rest of the day trying to distract myself from sleep. That wasn't particularly hard. I had been asleep for 12 straight hours. But as the night wound on, that feeling of heavy eyelids became harder and harder to ignore. The TV shows became a little less stimulating, the bed became a little more comfortable, and my head began to dip and slide towards my chest. They wouldn't let me have any coffee for some reasons, no stimulants at all, and the water was cutting it not at all. I made it till just after sunrise, somehow, but as I slipped into unconsciousness, I was greeted with something worse than I could have ever imagined. As I slipped off, I was treated to the worst vision yet. I was sitting high up now, in a throne room straight from the mind of Wes Craven. When they speak of otherworldly geometry in Lovecraft, I have to believe they've seen this place. Nothing was equal, nothing congruent. The angles hurt to look at, the edges were like razor blades, and the building was either made by a madman or someone who was driven mad by its construction. When you read this, you won't understand, but I ask you to try. The room looked like it was designed to inspire anxiety, foster nightmares, put the inhabitants on edge until madness swallowed them whole. The whole room was a dirty white. It wasn't off-white, it wasn't a dark white, it was a filthy white. I had seen the way windows look when they're caked with mud, and that was this color. It made my skin crawl, or it would have if I'd had any skin at that moment. The color was throughout. The feeling it gave me, coupled with the anxiety from the construction I was now inside of, made me want to shudder and vomit at the same time. It was filled with pews, which were piled with the muddy frog creatures I'd seen before. They were all manner of sizes, their lumpy bodies pressed into those seats as they sat there in rapture of me, it seemed. They were dressed strangely in garments I can only describe as fancy rags, and as I watched, the show began. A line of naked, screaming people were dragged forward, unclothed brown creatures prodding them with sticks as they looked at me in horror. These people were in terrible shape. The best among them were bruised and dirty, but some of them were lucky to be standing. I could see bodies burned down to the white meat, bones poking from them, eyes and limbs missing. But the most horrifying part was how these injuries didn't seem to bother them. They were filthy and afraid, but I got the feeling that their injuries were secondary in their mind. As the first one was pushed towards me, the brown creature opened its mouth and spoke with a voice like a well filled with water. "We have rounded up these cattle for punishment, my lord." I was confused as the dark-haired man who was roughly my age stumbled forward, but I wouldn't have long to revel in that lack of knowledge. "Who dares to trespass within my realm?" I heard it and turned, though I had no body. I was held aloft on a pedestal, and the creature beside me seemed to be my captor. It was beyond all earthly description, but I will try. Imagine one of those Jim Henson Skeksis had all the skin burned off of it, down to the bone, and then had the flesh reapplied badly with red and brown Play-Doh. Its eyes were piss-yellow slits, its jaws were beak-like and sharp-looking, and its flesh appeared to be oozing as it spoke in a thick, deep voice like a frog at the bottom of a ravine. It spoke to the brown creatures, telling them how they wanted the people tortured, and then, suddenly, it noticed me. Turning its head, it smiled as it saw me looking at it, and its pleasure was even worse than its anger somehow. "See what awaits you, human. Witness and despair." It croakingly hissed out these words at me. I came awake, screaming again, and thankfully, they didn't put me under this time. I've been in the restraints for 4 days now. They transferred me to a psychiatric ward, and the straps were to stop me from digging at my skin. I've been awake for 4 days, refusing to go to sleep because every time I nod off, I'm returned to that hateful place. I gaze upon that creature as he passes judgment, never sleeping, never leaving, and I wake up screaming. I've begged my doctors not to sedate me, but I think they will before long. I'm writing this under heavy supervision, trying to explain to my doctors since words seem to have failed me. I'm hoping he understands that, despite my state, I don't want to hurt myself. I've seen what lies beyond, and it's not something I'm in any hurry to get to. Good evening, my little creeperonis. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's reading. Oh, it's that time again. Time to thank our patrons. Thanks to Leslie Lou Riddle for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributor. Thanks, Leslie. Couldn't do it without you. If you too would like to join Leslie in our Spooky Skeleton tier, come on down to Patreon and become a patron. We have several fun tiers that you might enjoy. Or just come back and listen every week. We do love an audience. And as always, Dr. Plague signing off. Have a wonderful